in the greater Houston area. So, Dr. Boyd, all yours. No worries. We roll with the punches.
Perfect. How's that? That's better. I anticipated that. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to first begin by thanking Dr. Price for the opportunity to serve as the moderator for this outstanding panel. As was mentioned, my name is Rachel Boyd, and I'm an assistant professor at the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston. And my work focuses on empowering Black communities by pursuing equity in Black infant health, addressing racial disparities in child welfare, and addressing structural inequality in Black communities. My practice background is in public child welfare out in California, and I just consider it a privilege to be here. This is exciting. All of us have been fed very well today so far. I feel full, but now I ask you to make a little room, make more room on your plate, because we have an excellent panel here. And I just want to quote, we just finished listening to an excellent speaker, and I already want to quote him. Is he in? No, he's not in the room. He said, "What we are doing today is quite radical at its core." And that resounded with me. So I wanted to repeat it just as a way of kicking off the next phase of the program today. And so what I'll do now is I just want to again reiterate, please submit your questions as the panel is speaking. I have a list of questions here, but we really want to engage with you, and we really want to answer the questions that are on your hearts. So we will make time for that. What I'll do now is I'll begin by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves, to take 1 or 2 minutes to introduce yourself. Please let us know who you are and what you're working on, what your work and your capacity, and then we'll get into our questions.
I am Nora Bishop, I go by Minnie, and I am responsible for the initiatives for reduction of disproportionality and disparities in the system in the state of Florida, and also the reduction in the reliance on secure detention placements.
Good afternoon. My name is Calvin Martin. I am the statewide director for program advocacy and inclusion as part of the Florida Guardian Ad Litem program. And as part of that responsibility the goal is to pretty much look at child advocacy outcomes and try to look at how do we improve those, not just from a program standpoint, but also through a child welfare standpoint. So impacting the entire system as a whole.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. I'm Zuleika Henderson. I'm currently a full-time lecturer at Columbia University in the School of Social Work in New York. I'm also a social worker, and my work is manyfold, but my research looks at how Black teens define trauma and how they define healing and the implications of their definitions for the development of mental health services. Currently, I'm also working on development of programs and initiatives for Black people who do not see traditional Eurocentric mental health services as an option for healing. So really changing the game around what it means to develop and facilitate and implement mental health services in Black communities.
Hi, my name is Emma, and I am a Ketteringham. I'm from the Bronx Defenders, which is located in the South Bronx in New York. And before I say what I am, I was wondering if there are any lawyers here in the room. Okay. So I am a lawyer. I was wondering how quickly I should run for my car when this is done. So the Bronx Defenders is a multidisciplinary public defender organization. We basically represent low-income adults in Bronx criminal court, family court, immigration proceedings, and civil proceedings. So I'm a practitioner and I run an office of practitioners, and I'm incredibly intimidated by being at a conference and in a conversation about theory and research, but I'm going to do my best. But just to know, the family defense practice at the Bronx Defenders, which I run, we very, very proudly provide zealous representation to parents in the child protection system. And we work according to a holistic model. So that means that all clients don't just receive an attorney, they receive a parent affected who has been affected by the system themselves as an advocate, and a social worker who's part of the defense team, which is a little bit different of a vantage point. And we're pretty big. We have 40 attorneys and 20 social workers and parent advocates. I'm really excited to be here, so thank you very much.
Thank you all for those introductions. The first question we have for the panel is, how do you define racial equity, and how does that definition inform your work? Any of you can jump in, and for each of the questions that I ask, you are all welcome to answer, but not obligated to do so. So we'll just have a free-flowing conversation.
Well, we define race equity as impartial and just and fair treatment of all youth as they encounter and or flow through the juvenile justice system. And so my team, we look at are similarly situated kids receiving similar outcomes? And if not, why is that? What is going on? And it's interesting because the juvenile justice system's response usually is one of trying to implement equality, but when kids are not starting at the same place, giving them the same thing is not the answer. So the goal should be to get to the same outcome and looking at what the kids need in order to achieve that outcome.
Pretty much we look at it as, especially from a child welfare perspective, is identifying it as balanced outcomes. And so the goal is to, we understand the discrepancies, we understand the disproportionate numbers, but the goal is to take it from a generalized vantage point and ensuring that when we look at this, particularly the different races and genders that are prevalent within our system, is to try to, how do we find out, engage balance within that system? And the first place to do that is through data analysis, and then identify what type of available data there is available out there. The other thing, though, is also take it and try to frame it into a process that we like to think of it as racial and ethnic identity, and ensuring that, particularly when our program deals with children that are already in the system, on the back end of the system, the goal is, how do we ensure particularly youth that are in child welfare long-term, that are beyond the average time that they should be in the system, 2+ years, how do we ensure that their ethnic and racial identity are sustained? And so we go about taking measures on reinforcing their cultural identity, and doing that through specific means that we'll get into later on in this panel.
Thank you.
I want to emphasize that, as a public defender in the Bronx, basically, by definition, all of our clients are low wealth, and the vast overwhelming majority are Black and brown. So, in our work, to me, racial equity work means ensuring that Black and brown families aren't separated and aren't dissolved. And we almost see what we do in providing zealous representation to parents is really divesting the foster system one child at a time, not letting it grow and shrinking it small. the intention of the child protection system might not be to dissolve Black and brown families, but that is what we see it doing. We also try to look at data in our work, and the data in New York City is shameful and pretty awful. So in 2018, for example, ACS, which is our CPS, removed an average of 230 children a month. 97% of those children were non-white. So it's not even really about racial disproportionality. This is a system that is reserved solely for Black and brown families in New York City. And so our work as the advocates for the parents who are hanging on to their children and at risk of losing what is most precious to them, we consider ourselves to be in the trenches of racial equity work. We have a lot to learn ourselves. This is not to champion ourselves as doing the work perfectly, because we're not. I mean, we are a city agency. We are part of the system, right? We're fulfilling an obligation in the system. Parents have to be represented, and we fulfill that obligation. And so in many ways, we're part of the same system that we're trying to divest, but that's sort of how we really view our work. It is work in the trenches for racial equity. It's nothing less than that.
I think the only thing that I would add is, so my experience, I feel like is twofold. So not only have I been and continue to work on the front lines in some capacities, but also as an educator, I have a responsibility also as a gatekeeper for engaging aspiring social work professionals to be thinking about, one, not only what the impact of the absence of equity, the impact of racism, oppression, power, and privilege, but to ask the question often for them, on the front lines, what does it look like in terms of specific practice behaviors to try to work to transform what we are seeing specific to the impact of racism and oppression to the data that everyone is describing. So not only in theory or to say it sounds nice to want to do things different and to be a different kind of social worker, but to really to ask the questions of what does that look like and mean in terms of a specific practice behavior. So when I look at cases or when I prepare to sit with families, what is it that I need to be doing on the front lines that can really help to push forward this idea of justice and equity. And then also on the side of the families, working directly with Black and brown families, I work to address and hold space for the impact that these things are having on families, right? So not just being able to acknowledge the data of saying, in these communities, many families have been removed, but to go behind the numbers and to hear the stories. And so what does it look like to hold space with a family, a caregiver whose testimony is that I haven't had a chance to be heard, that my family was just dismantled today, and I'm impacted in this way. And so for me, doing the work is twofold, creating opportunities to hold that space, really thinking about what mental health and healing looks like for people who are impacted by this data, and also the responsibility to prepare the actual people who are on the front lines, who are going to help us to either make a transition to doing, to living the ideas and ideals that we talk about, or to reinforcing more of the same.
Thank you for those responses. Now we have a question from social media that we'll put up now for our panelists. One moment. The first question from social media is, implicit bias, by definition, is an involuntary response. Some counties have utilized blind processes to mitigate disparity. Is there some value in blind processes that are coupled with seeing families for who they are? And the question is posted behind you in case you want to glance at it, panel. Take a stab. Any of you can jump in when you are ready, and then I think the others will catch up.
Yeah, I think that for me, it's this idea of, and I think that this was brought up earlier in Corey's presentation, this idea of seeing me, right, is a part of really understanding what my experience is, and understanding that we function and operate in a frame where the occurring world is that also seeing me brings up some lens for you at the same time, right? And so it's kind of working in those two worlds. So a specific example for me, particularly with students, is, so we talk about implicit bias, and we talk about whiteness, we talk about white supremacy, we talk about anti-Blackness. And sometimes when people start to engage in those conversations and deal with the discomfort that comes with having to put up the mirror, then often in the papers and in the case presentations, people end up saying things like, well, I'm white, so I can't understand a Black family. And so they feel like that's the answer to the question at the end of, the paper. Well, this family is Black. And so what I get from this conversation is that I don't have any way to understand what they're going through. So I ended up feeling like they just have to throw their hands up. And so for me, it's, okay, so with that awareness, how do I engage the awareness of race, of identity, of racism, of oppression, and still figure out that if I have a seat at the table of making a decision about what to do, how can I engage my understanding of that while still in process of doing the work? So taking a chance to say the already always listening, kind of this idea that for me, in the world that I've grown in, here's what I have learned Blackness to mean. Sitting for a second, know what you're walking into the room with, so that you can be aware of that, and then create space to say, got it. Now, how do I be present enough to hear what's going on, to be mindful of the impact that reality is having on the decisions that I'm making? How do I do those things in a way that will help me to make a responsible decision? So seeing people for who they truly are, seeing them for their experience, and being mindful of the impact kind of that this already occurring world of racism and stereotypes, what that does, the impact that has had on me walking in the room. And so it's a practice, for many of us, this is our first time hearing this conversation, hearing these words, or having to hold up the mirror in these ways. And so really just starting to work the muscle to be mindful and to do both.
I mean, sorry.
No. It's really and the add on to that, it's really about adding on to the value of what cultural context for a particular family means, and particularly with not just us as frontline staff or those who work in administration. I think the true paradox really falls on how are attorneys and judges within the courtroom environment, how is that applicable to them also? Because that's really where the true decision making occurs. So how long a family stays within the system, the judges want to make the determination, and usually because of all the legal language that runs through and families not being aware of what's being said, when you begin to kind of take the cultural context of a family into account and add it to the decision-making process, which is, and I'll circle this back to how this all correlates to implicit bias, but you actually are able to add what is valuable to the family themselves, whether it's a family's religion, whether it's a family, whether it's a child's birthday, whether it's a child's or family's language, or the country of origin, all that comes into play. What they celebrate, what they find important, with their where they go to church, all that taking into context and making it part, and for an attorney or for a judge to actually allow that to be part of the decision, I think takes the level of implicit bias that is inherent in a lot of decisions that we kind of see within the child welfare system. It also helps remove that. And so when you do blind staffings, that is just another mechanism that we can utilize to fairly remove the unconscious bias that is evident in a lot of decision making within this particular system.
No, I think it goes back to something I said earlier. What happens and what has happened when even we have done juvenile justice system reform in the name of reducing disproportionality, what happens is we have overall outcomes that says maybe arrests went down or commitments went down. But when you disaggregate that data by race and ethnicity, what you will see is that your disproportionality has gone up. Whatever the process you implement in a blind way, I can't answer why, but it's a fact that the white kids are going to benefit a lot faster than any kid of color. And so what you'll end up with is a system that is with more kids of color that are going deeper into that system, whether it be juvenile justice or children and families, and you're not helping them. If the goal is to make the family, get the families to the place where they can operate independent of both systems, then I have to understand that family. And if I'm doing it from a blind or you fit this mold, you get this sort of way, then how do I get to that place when I didn't even understand the perspective of the family in the first place?
I mean, I agree with that. And I would just add that I think part of the reason why some of the studies that have shown that blind decision-making works or doesn't work is they're done because there's something wrong with the system, right? They're done because those of us, and I include lawyers for parents who do this work, even though we might be viewed as like on the right side in a room like this as representing the parents, we're still obviously just as vulnerable to holding racist beliefs and implicit bias and acting upon them in our daily work. But if we sort of overly rely on blind processes, it stops us from really figuring out what is wrong with the system itself. And also, I'm not as interested in things that look to fix the system as it is, as I am in things that look to eradicate it completely. So sometimes, you start to sort of think about things that will make it look better or seem better, but it is still a system that was designed by people without their own families in mind to regulate others, to regulate people at the bottom of racial, gender, economic hierarchies. And you can't change that. You can't fix a system that was built to do that or be that way.
Now we have another question from social media, so we'll take this one as well. The question is, what advice do you have for how to respond when people insist that the disparities in child welfare are purely poverty-driven and not race-driven? That's a good question, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
To determine, first and foremost, how poverty is defined. And for the most part, in our system, particularly, and I'll go back a decade or two first before I move it forward. It appears, and then I'll be straight up with this, that we define poverty as neglect. So as we look at our numbers, you go back through, and we heard it earlier in our presentation, multiple years, despite the number of different secretaries, despite the changes in policies and procedures, despite the changes in laws, there was one thing that remained constant. That was the disproportionate number of children of color in the system. And so, and then when you review the data, particularly the zip codes where our children are coming from, and then obviously the majority's zip codes have a high level of poverty within these communities. On top of that, a lot of these communities are communities of color, and so on and so on. And so the first thing that you have to do to try to resolve that, one is through education. You got to get out in the community and you have to speak the truth. We have to have the courageous conversations that are needed in order to educate those of us outside that do not work in this system in an everyday fashion. And then you also are going to probably have to, whether you convince them or not, you're going to have to do it from a data approach, and then also do it from a story approach, which is actually going to have probably more meaning and more impact when you actually can connect children and families to the data. And so, so going back to how do you specifically respond? It's really about changing the poverty equals neglect and changing it to something else beyond that, moving beyond what that historical definition that we've always seen has. And so, and I think that is occurring in multiple communities, as I find, not just in Central Florida or North Florida or South Florida, but it's occurring in areas that we may not hear every day. So
I agree with that 100%. And usually, I mean, I get this question a lot. And usually I'm like, how much time do you have to talk about it? But, you know, clearly poverty is a huge driving force of children into the foster system. I don't think we'd have the response that we have of removal, family separation, and giving up on a parent if they can't get it together within 12 months to the way we define they should be together if the families in the system were white. So regardless of what is the driving force that gets you in there, I think the response that we have, which is the system that we have, it's a response of family separation, something that every study and piece of research shows is harmful. It's a harmful response. I don't think we would have that if this were a system, again, designed and operated by people who have their own families in mind. And if they built it for their own families, it wouldn't look like what it does. And I also know I'm a mother. I'm a mother of 2 boys, and the world interacts with me completely differently when I do the same things that my clients do. It's a reality every day. My interactions with my children's teachers, if I'm late for pickup, my interactions with my kids' pediatricians, if I'm not exactly sure how they were hurt, my, my mistakes, my losses of temper, everything I do as a parent is just treated differently. I know it because I stand next to my clients and watch them be judged for it, and literally raise my hand and say, I just did that, or that happened to me, or I'm from Park Slope, Brooklyn, where probably, 5 out of 10 parents use drugs without recourse, without worry that it's going to result in them losing their children. So it's almost, this is a very, very important question, but also what's important is, why does the system respond? Does the system respond the way it does because of poverty, or does it respond the way it does because of race?
Also, we can also adapt this question for juvenile justice system. And I think the same type of question is asked, but it's framed in the sense of um, Black youth committing more crime, and as that being the driver behind disparity or disproportionality. Do you have any thoughts regarding that type of question or type of framing as the problem being that having that type of root as opposed to anything else?
Answer is actually pretty much the same. The You can switch the question, but you don't really have to. I actually have had a judge say to me that we have more kids in the juvenile justice system because of poverty and not because of race. That exact statement. So you didn't necessarily have to reframe it, but the answer or the way it was responded to was one of data, because we took kids of different colors with all the same factors and showed what happened to those kids, and the responses were different, and you can't dispute that. So it has to be an issue or a matter of race, and not necessarily that the kids are coming in with differing variables.
Thank you. So I have we've talked about some data and studies. I have a research question that I'll ask, but I want to prep the audience that after I ask this question, I will ask if anyone has a question for the panel as well, so we can take some of your questions live in the room. I also want to give a disclaimer that I'm managing the discussion with my phone too, so I'm not just being rude and texting. Just so you know, I started to get self-conscious about it a little bit, but I thought I'll just tell everyone that's what I'm doing. I'm not texting. I'm managing. We're dialoguing about what to do next in real time. So this question, there's a couple here. I'll ask a multi-part question, and then feel free to respond as you wish. Can you talk about what racial equity research has guided your work, and what key factors have been identified at being at the root of racial inequities in child welfare, juvenile justice, and family outcomes? Lastly, what are we missing? What are the questions that are not being asked and need to be asked? Based on your work, what areas of racial justice and equity still need more research? So that's a lot there. But again, the first part is asking about racial equity research that's guiding your work, what's been identified as key root factors, and lastly, what type of research is needed that's not being done.
Okay, so racial equity research that guides the work of our team. In Florida, we happen to be privileged to have one of the most technologically advanced and comprehensive information systems in the nation. So we can pull data from many years, disaggregate it as many ways as you want to understand the what. And then my team's responsibility is to dig deeper to understand the why. And so we use a lot of information from that. We use our partnership with the Annie Casey Foundation, of course. We use our partnership with the Burns Institute to inform our work. But we look at what's going on. We dig deeper. We do parent group conversations, as talked about, to really understand the nature of a problem before we implement any sort of solution, making sure that parent and youth voice is at the table. The things that we, I think, have identified, honestly, it is the mindset of the system, right? We focus on things that have already been said. We focus on what the weaknesses are, right? And how do we fix them, because we're somehow the superheroes and the experts on these families, as opposed to figuring out what the strengths are and how we build upon them, right? And how we act as a partner as opposed to a superhero. So it's I think the mindsets, the responses of the system, and I think it's the biases that people are not willing to accept from all the levels, from the officers to the probation officers to the people that work in the court. All of these things play a part, and it's very difficult for people to accept that it is a human trait to have bias and that it plays a part in every single thing that you do. Implicit bias is just a part of how your brain works, and that I need to be aware of that, right? And I need to be mindful of it as I make decisions to make sure that I'm being fair. And so those really are the things that are triggering what's happening. And we have to shift it. We have to shift the system in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And there's a lot of different ideas about how to do that are similar to some of the things that have been discussed. I think what is missing is how do we create a different system? Answering that question and changing the question from, well, this kid has a high level of needs is what we say, right? Although all other measures would say that I should use this level of intervention, but there's this high level of needs, so I'm going to push the kid to this level of intervention. And when you talk about the juvenile justice system, that's a life-lasting impact on that child. So it's not that they were a greater risk to public safety, but that they had a high level of needs and then they have to pay for that the rest of their life. That's not fair, right? The question should be, if this kid had these same issues, right? These same needs, and they had not committed a crime, or someone had not made that call, what would we implement, or what doesn't exist that we would be able to implement or should be able to implement in the community to meet those needs and not punish the kid because of them?
There are two things. The first one is implicit bias. That's our biggest thing that we're truly kind of focused on right now. And the reason being is because of the decision-making process, trying to improve that to the best of our capability. And because we know that stereotypes drive a lot of perceptions on how we see the world, how we see our surroundings, how we see our environment. And just to speak for, I'll speak for our program, I won't speak for the entire system, or I feel that I could, but I won't point that finger yet. But part of it is when you have a child that comes from a perceived low income environment, and yet we have representatives that come from middle class or higher. There are inherent things that we have to guard against that have the potential to frame our decisions in our interactions with this family, and particularly if the family exhibits anything that our group perceives as stereotypical behavior. And so we think that initially doing a initial approach towards training, towards implicit bias, and informing, educating our program on the impact that unconscious biases have on how we interact with the world. The hope is to begin to create a shift that will help at least minimally bring an awareness to a group that may not necessarily perceive or may have never walked in the shoes of someone else. And that also, now you got to remember, implicit bias was known as cultural diversity. Before that, known as other diversities, other biases. It's made a shift, and it's seen as the PC term of the day right now. It does have its detractors, but it also has its benefits in research and practice that shows that it can and does make some awareness changes, or minimally bring education to individuals that potentially remain themselves or open themselves to it. The second thing is poverty. We know that it goes back to the question that we had before. Poverty is a fact of life, and the question is, those in the system, how do we perceive those in poverty? So implicit bias and poverty are almost brothers and sisters, because there is a perception of those who that we perceive to be from an economic disadvantaged environment, and so we may place certain value or lack of on that, and in that we are now trying to tend to kind of look deeply. Is there some type of influencer based on for our level of thinking, based on where this person comes from, based on the economic value or lack thereof that they have? And so poverty and implicit bias are the two levels of research that we're currently truly focused on right now, along with racial and ethnic identity work, and trying to ensure that children within the system ensure their maintain their cultural history as they travel through or through their journey within the system itself.
I would say two things. So again, speaking from just the experience in terms of social work education, I think that it's just, I started as part of the inaugural cohort of facilitators to teach a course at Columbia called Foundations of Social Work Practice, Decolonizing Social Work. And this course was the result of student demands for transforming the way that education and business was done in a school of social work, and to really confront and address the layers of racism and oppression, et cetera, that were happening. And so what we noticed with this shift in the course is that students are, asked to engage with these ideas differently. So for me, I guess the question becomes, what does it look like to transform our systems and structures so that we don't have to start forcing this conversation in, but that the new norm is that this is where we start with these understandings that the mission, the values, the work that we do, the laws that we have and the policies, et cetera, how do we start transforming so that the culture that we're working with now is a culture that says that this is the ideas associated with racial equity or operating in that ways is the normal. So that when people are asking questions, well, is this about poverty or is this about racism? We have a culture that says, now instead of, posing that question to us, you need to answer the question of, say more about why you're asking, right? What is it? What's underneath your question? And when we're centering conversations about race, right? If that's, what's happening, then what do we have to confront and to see when we're thinking about this in terms of race and racism? And so I guess what I'm thinking as next steps, or what more work needs to be done, is what does it really look like to put in the work to shift the culture so that we're not always having to fight from one vantage point to reprove a point that we have proven so many times before. So how do we start naming? What are the specific barriers that are there? And what does it look like to do this work when there are still policies, there are still people in decision-making positions who are not willing to accept or acknowledge that race is a factor, that equity is an issue. And so what might it look like to make improvements, to see differences in outcome when we feel like we keep running into those walls? So how are people overcoming and being able to do work like the group described there when those barriers still exist? And so maybe putting out more information about that gives people models to work with in communities around the world. Oh, sorry. I have my own.
So we use, some racial equity research to guide our work, but obviously we're in a little bit of a different spot in the sense that we fulfill a mandate of the system. We represent parents. And what we do try to do is bring some of the research out there into the courtroom to inform a judge of why they might be seeing this family here. And that's in order to sort of disabuse them of the notion that this family's here because they've done something terrible. And so we talk about the disparities a lot. We talk a lot about the disparities in who ends up in the courtroom and who doesn't. So many, and this might be common in your jurisdiction as well, but we know many families end up in the child welfare system because women are tested for drugs when they give birth, right? They are tested often without their notice, often without their consent. And what the research shows is that it's Black women who are 10 times more likely than white women to be reported to child welfare authorities. And that's despite equal rates of drug use during pregnancy and otherwise by white women and Black women. So we'll try to talk about that in the courtroom and bring that in as part of our defense. Now, it's not easy to do that. We have the same judges, as I'm sure you have, who are pretty resistant to hearing anything that goes beyond what this particular individual before them has done. but we push them to have a greater perspective, because the point is, of course, not all people are in here having drug use confused with child neglect or abuse. Just some people are. Who is? Why? And we try to push the judges to think that way. Another, we also have cases that come in, as I'm sure you do, where parents have children presenting with injuries they can't explain. They have a baby who suffers collapse, month or weeks after birth. Tragic. And a study of the Philadelphia pediatric ER showed that children who present with the same head injuries, white children who present with the same head injuries as Black children, they don't get referred to the child abuse team to be worked up, to be investigated, to be examined, right? They're met with compassion and care and worry, because here's a parent presenting at the ER with their child who is hurt and doesn't know how they were hurt. So it's a whole different response. So we try to bring that data into the courtroom. So that's some of the racial equity data that we look at and that drives our work. But I think really probably the research that we rely on the most is the research that shows the harm of the current response. The fact that in order to save children, we tend to rely on a response that does them more harm. And that doesn't only cause harm for that child, but perpetuates it for generations. And so, some of I'm sure that you all are familiar with a lot of that research as well. But, one of the biggest studies that was done was by Joseph Doyle of MIT. And, he looked at 15,000 families and found that the children who remained at home compared to the children who went into foster care did better at every level. And these are homes where caseworkers had gone in and found the magic word, risk. They'd found risk, but they did something different. They did something creative. They provided support to the family, and the children stayed home. And those children did better. And so that's the research often that we try to bring in, is even when we're litigating an individual removal hearing. Even when the state is trying to take a child, we will bring in an expert to testify to the harm of that response. And that is a totally different way of litigating these cases, at least than what was being done in New York City before. Before we became a holistic provider of defense there, parents were relying almost entirely on solo practitioners who didn't have the funds for experts, didn't have the funds for investigators, didn't have the funds for social workers and parent advocates to work alongside with them as part of the defense team. And so that has really sort of changed and transformed the way parents are represented. And we're able to bring a lot of this research into the courtroom for the first time.
Thank you. Now we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Are you using implicit bias synonymous with white privilege, or isn't it true that all people have implicit bias? I know that oftentimes we're talking out in the open, like we're saying, be honest about things. I mean, oftentimes, I feel like, especially if I have to bring bad news to my clients or decisions made sometimes I don't have any control over, oftentimes I'm accused of racism simply because I'm white, even though I may have worked very hard on the benefit of the family. And I know a lot of people call that playing the race card. I don't like that terminology, but you hear people say that. Can you speak to that?
Great question.
The first thing, the moment you said client, that it created a question for me. I wanted to define what client was. So is client a child? Is client, and it's something that you don't necessarily need to answer before I answer your question real quick. But first thing I thought about, was it a child? Was it a parent? What was the gender of the parent? What was the race of the child? Things of that nature. But to go back to your other question was, does everybody have, do we all have implicit bias? And absolutely. There is, especially when you look at the specific term of what implicit bias really is, in an unconscious feeling that has been or experience or knowledge that has been perpetuated or evolved within an individual person over the course of their lifetime based off their experiences, what they've been exposed to, which continuously gets perpetuated by media, by everything that you experience, whether going through childhood, through adulthood. It gets solidified. How you act on it also determines, your level of awareness to that. And so now tying that to white privilege is a whole nother ball game, so because then it really depends on, are we talking about implicit bias or are we talking about explicit bias, so and where do you fall on the pendulum with that, so which only you can answer that. If you want to truly get into specifically how to tie whether white privilege is even a factor in that, which I'm not going to assume that it is. And so, but what it kind of boils down to really, and is that what type of experience that the client, has, what type of trauma that the client has undergone, what is the how did the client come to your attention in the first place? Are they a product of the system? How long have they been in the system? And so there are so many different variables. What's that person's experience? What type of level of racism have they dealt with? So you asked it's a good question, but it's a very complex question too at the same time.
A commitment to making sure that I'm not being seen as racist, and a difference between having the willingness to engage myself to do a self-assessment and an analysis of the situation to say, is there any way in which racism or my own biases can be affecting what I'm doing? And so if I'm sitting in the seat of just trying to prove to somebody around me who is questioning my behavior that I'm not racist, then I'm in a whole different conversation that oftentimes has nothing to do with the clients or the people that we're serving, right? And so if I need to prove to somebody that I'm not racist, then I can have a conversation with myself about how I want to show up in communities, so that it's clear, not just that I want to engage what I'm not, but that in who I am, people are able to be clear based on my actions and my communications, that I'm committed to seeing the true value, worth, and dignity of people. And I'm committed to doing an assessment to be aware of whether or not my thinking, my behaviors, my actions, the decisions that I'm suggesting are in alignment with having done a holistic assessment of myself and a level of self-awareness that could demonstrate that I'm actually acting in an anti-oppressive way. And so I think that there are different questions that we can ask ourselves on the front lines, in supervision or whatever. Is this a conversation where I need to show somebody that I'm not a racist person, versus have I been invited to consider whether or not racism, oppression, and other factors that I may be consciously aware of or not are at play here. And so I think that those could be two different questions.
Should I try to reassure the person that that racism did not factor in, or should I simply ignore it?
I think that you should reframe. I might invite you to reframe, well, what's the goal of your interaction? Is the goal to end at a conversation about racism, or is the goal to end at making sure that what the actions that are happening in this exchange are about making sure that the welfare of somebody's child, the welfare of somebody's family, the welfare of somebody is central to what's happening here? And so again, reframing what is it that you want to accomplish in this exchange? Is it just so that the people that you are serving or working with or collaborating with know that you are not a racist person, versus you want the outcome of the experience in which you're involved in to be something where justice, anti-oppressive practice, and behavior is really central to what happens?
Just to add to that real quick, it could be about relationship too, because that creates a question of what type of relationship is this a family that you just met? And it probably speaks to putting yourself in a position to build a relationship to where the level of comfort gets to a point to where that question may not never be needs to be answered, or it gets resolved based on your overall interaction with the family. It resolves in their mind that, okay, maybe because they could be speaking from a pain or from a past experience too at the same time, and then taking it out on you as the white male that comes to their house to speak to them about this issue within the system. So it may not necessarily be about you, but could be about that pain that they're going through and the system itself, which they're identifying you with, as they do with all of us.
It can be. I said, and it can be about us sometimes as well. And so again, I would say, do I have the willingness to engage them about their experience, right? So can I ask? Got it. Tell me, how did I show up for you as well? I think going back to the survey that you were talking about earlier, where families get a chance to give us feedback. Am I a person in this work who's positions myself to be able to hear that? It doesn't make me defensive, right? We're human, right? So it's not to act like we get to show up and not be impacted by things. We're gonna be impacted. Again, what am I prepared to do with the feedback that I get from people? And am I prepared to hear from the people that I serve that I actually might be doing something that's hurtful and harmful? And when I hear that, then what am I prepared to do with it?
So I'm just going to make an observation with that last conversation and then possibly get a question out if we have time. So what I've heard about wanting to tell a parent or family that you're not racist is definitely rooted in dominance. So we're working with an individual who feels often outnumbered, outgunned, outraged, never listened to, and you show up phenotypically and white. You must be mindful not of your individual biases, let alone, but also the power that you bring with you behind that badge. So it is not necessarily your responsibility to just make a person listen to you just because you want to say, I'm not a racist. They should be able to have a choice in the matter as well. It's not just because you said it that they're supposed to just get it. Think about the fact that that's what they've been told all this time, yet and still there's been nothing done to show up differently, and you represent every other social worker, attorney who have come before you. So that's one point. But the other piece that I'm hearing is a lot about fixing people. So it gets me into this service arena where there's a level of risk involved if we keep families together, specifically Black and brown families, because they're poor. So of course, we know having a little more resources will get us, balance or mitigate some stressors, right? We also know that an adverse childhood experience, one of them is having dirty clothes. So where can we find rolls of quarters, right? But when it comes to poverty and the direct correlation to child welfare entry, I think it's logical for us to link poverty, not racism, to the fact that these kids are coming in. It makes more sense because of capitalistic society, right? We know that if people have tangible resources, because just look around us at our peers, if they have some more resources, they're able to mitigate certain stresses. So my question would be for the panel, implicit, explicit aside, what needs to be done truly, one, to increase a level of risk tolerance for working with Black and brown families? Because again, tweaking this system that we're talking about, racism, is not going to work. We have to abolish it and create something new if we want to see something different happen. And I think from my perspective, it starts with challenging the thinking. So how do we create opportunities for a mindset shift? What needs to be done there? From a practice perspective, I truly believe that it's practice that drives effective policy, not the other way around, because we can write things until we're blue in the face and nothing is adhered to. And also, I know from a personal perspective that left to my own devices, I won't hold myself accountable. I have to have some measures in place to deactivate these things while working with individuals. So mindset, practice, and accountability, what needs to be done there to have us think differently, do differently, and be differently with Black and brown families, specifically about racism? And then just the last point, just a common thread that I've heard when it comes to training and tweaks and implementing and putting stuff in place. I haven't heard anybody specifically, Garden ad litem, what about racism? What about discussing or training individuals on how the world was formed to come up with common language and a foundation in which we can build on? Because diversity keeps us in the weeds. Inclusion keeps us in the weeds. Cultural competence keeps us in the weeds. We're specifically talking about equity is not a reality right now. In order to achieve it, we have to talk about racism in order to achieve race equity.
To answer, there's two questions, Corey, that you mentioned. The first one is what can we do to impact this matter? Two things. Well, really one in particular that I think I've seen a movement over the past couple of years on, that's trauma informed. And particularly, you mentioned ACEs. I think that is truly a path that the system is beginning to truly embrace, because when we begin to educate ourselves as a system on the type of history and trauma and why families are the way they are, how and what is it that has formed their some of the trauma, the issues throughout their lives. I think that's when we can begin to have a better understanding, a higher level of empathy, utilize some of that favorable training, whether it's implicit bias or other kind of diversity training, in order to, I think, try to better communicate, better assist, better not allow our own biases to kind of drive the decision-making process. So I truly believe that the wave of ACEs study and trauma-informed care is, I think, very critical to the system as a whole. So as long as we, as a whole, as a system, stay on that path, I can see a better future within the system years from now. Secondly, I got to address this one thing, because I felt you called us out, so I got to talk about it. One thing about when it comes to racism, the one thing that we have done in the past several years, and this is a training that we adopted from Casey Family, actually. I'm a certified trainer in knowing who you are. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it is that focus on racial and ethnic identity, ensuring that children within long-term care maintain their cultural identity. Part of that is a pure focus on issues of race, and particularly white privilege. So in that training, which is a 2-day workshop, it does create some uncomfortable questions. It's a tough training to go through, and particularly for white people, but we've done well over 20 trainings across this state in the past several years. And we do invite community partners to join us in that effort. And so we do invite the department, the CBC personnel to attend that training. And so, And only I would say on one hand, out of all those trainings where I can count, where someone did not walk out or where someone walked out truly unhappy with the training, whereas the majority of those that have gone through the training, truly their lens was shifted. So they were able to have those courageous conversations about issues of race. How does that impact? How does that factor into the system itself as a whole? And so that is something that we are looking at. Granted, it has been a couple of years since we had the last training, but that's something that we are beginning to kind of circle back and refocus, and because Casey no longer supports that training because there's a 3-part training series, but that's something we're going to look at bringing back in some type of form.
One little small short question, I promise. Is our families invited to that? So one thing that I've noticed when we talk about deficiencies and risks and trauma and calling families toxic, we hoard information. We only train our own. We don't invite people to know what it is and how we're processing decisions and how decisions are made and what trauma-informed care looks like and all of those things. So our families invited to learn alongside with us.
Yeah, only families outside of the system, but that's a factor I've never actually considered. That's something that's something we do need to take a look at and make a determination on how do we facilitate something like that. And because the question is what we don't know. What that could create, so we see the positives behind it, especially as I quickly process it, but it's the unknowns that we have to assess and make a determination on. But we are part of the state, my friend, so we have to do what we can to avoid that too. So thank you, Corey.
Thank you. And for the sake of time, we're going to move on to another question that we have in the queue that will be posted on the screen. In Corey's presentation, we heard a lot about child removal being a last resort. What steps should case managers take to quicken the return of children where removal is absolutely necessary?
Can I want to just, I'm going to adjust my answer a little bit, but hopefully we'll get to that. One of the focuses of our program is to work with parents who've actually been affected and survived the system themselves, either with their children or not. We think all of their experiences are valuable to inform how we better stand up for them. And so one of the things that we were told is that we need access to advocates and attorneys before our children are taken and before we end up in court. We need someone to call, just like any rich person would. If they had a legal problem, they would call a lawyer and they would get some advice. And as our system is set up, parents only get lawyers once a judge tells them they get a lawyer. And in some states, they don't get one at all. And I am not suggesting that legal representation is the answer here, because needing legal representation is the problem, really. But what we did find when we sort of spoke to the families in the Bronx, they made it very clear to us that they feared the knock on the door by a caseworker much more than they did the stop in the street by NYPD, that the specter of losing their children was the most serious legal issue that they wanted assistance with. So we worked as allies to them and tried to get funding to put something like that in place. And so now, although, you're always at risk that they're going to take your funding away. That's the way the world is. But now, we have a hotline. We have 24-hour availability to parents who can call someone when they get the knock on the door, so that they have someone to give them information, to sometimes exercise their right not to let that person in their home, and to resist. And so just to give a little bit of and these are cases that I think the children would have been taken, right? It would have been viewed as necessary to take the child. But when this advocacy was in place to help parents themselves address whatever risk the state was concerned with, we had really great results. So 581 parents called us in 2018. Investigations were formally begun for not all of the families, but for over 500. And of those cases, 306 of them, no case was even filed. No case was even brought to court. Because when the parent felt empowered to be part of the conversation and had all the information that they needed to really sort of like really meet the case planner with their concerns and empowered to speak for themselves, and sometimes with an advocate by their side if that was what the parent chose. But when the parent understood what was happening and was empowered themselves, again, in 518 families where there was an investigation, in 306 of those, no case was even filed. Of the 194 cases that were filed, only 15% resulted in a child being placed in foster care. And when that happened, the harm of that removal, we were able to mitigate the harm of that removal by finding relatives before we ended up in court and making sure that that child never saw the inside of a processing center or the children's, sort of processing zone that can be so frightening. And actually in New York City, no one's ever been allowed inside of it except for ACS staff. And so, we were able to sort of prevent the worst harm from happening. And I raise that because I think there are a lot of people who can't even imagine it happening any differently, right? Can't even imagine that a child would not be removed. But I think one of the steps is to equal the playing field a little bit and give the parent access to some resources and advocacy of their own, someone who is accountable only to them in the process. And I would just add that right now, ACS actually does call us sometimes. And when they do, we usually can work together and avoid a removal. So strong, high-quality advocacy for parents is not antithetical to safety for children. And it's not even actually antithetical to the objectives of the child protective system.
Thank you. We have another question that will be posted on the screen. There has been a recent push for diversity and inclusion initiatives. Do you feel that diversity and inclusion efforts on an institutional level are effective?
I think for me, it's also pushing people to finish the sentence. What is it that you are trying to accomplish? Be specific, right? So if it's just that I want to see a number of people who look different on my staff, and that's what you're going for, then you know that you've accomplished your goal, right? But if you want to see progress in different ways, you need to spell out what that progress looks like. And you use that as the metric to determine whether whatever your efforts are creating transformation. I think we've talked about the buzzwords, before in class with students, especially in the social work profession. We have a lot of cliches. And I tell my students, don't put one cliche on that paper unless you go further to say, what does it mean in specific practice behaviors to meet somebody where they are? What does that look like? What are you doing? How are you being, right? And so, yeah, I guess my response to that question would be, we have to push people to be very specific about what it is that you're saying you're trying to do by diversifying or offering inclusivity training. And when you have that list of specifics, then you have a metric to measure the success of whatever it is that you have done. And so the act of diversifying and how people have operationalized that is not necessarily the thing that's going to create transformation, but it's being specific about, hey, these are the things that are not working. This is what's not working, and this is exactly what we're hoping to change. And so you go back and you ask yourself, is this the change that we are seeing based on whatever the action that we've made?
you won't have success unless you have leadership buy-in. And it's even goes beyond that, because you have multiple tiers within any organization. And if you even have a top tier, top down tier levels, then if you have top administration that creates a strategic plan, but there is no true buy-in even at the lower level tiers, then your level of institutional success will be nominal. And so the best way to do that is you need to, once you have leadership, top leadership buy-in, is to create a mechanism that will allow all tiers within the organization to provide buy-in to the actual strategies in order to meet the outcomes. And so that's how and why a lot of institutions do not that fail in trying to meet these types of goals. But I think once you get buy-in at all levels, and including frontline staff, then you gotta have buy-in from the people, from those that are actually doing it. Then I think that it can be successful. That's possible.
Okay, we have time for one more question, which we'll end with. It's another one from the audience. Okay, most of the conversation today has related to what happens to families once they become known to the system. How would you apply racial equity to prevention work?
Balancing knowledge and access. And I go there because I'm thinking about our recent work with domestic violence, which I know Mr. Best brought up earlier, but about maybe 4 years ago, I would say that 90% of the cases by which law enforcement went to the door for a domestic violence case, that kid was not only arrested, even though they may not have been the aggressor, but it was easy to remove the kid, but ended up in a detention center and sometimes even further in the system. And most of those kids were Black and brown kids that ended up in the system, whereas white kids might have been referred for services. And so the department did a lot of work around this. And because of the work, the information sharing, the things that we made available in the system, some of it came to a systematic issue that was causing that, in that there were laws that said the officer had to arrest somebody, right? So that's promoting that. There was a policy that said if the kid was arrested, then this had to happen, which was the most severe outcome. And so we looked at we changed those laws, and then we changed our policy, and we made the information and the services available without the criminal justice system. And then we worked to educate families if there were issues going on in the home, right? It didn't just start that day. There were other things that were going on over time that we gave them somebody to reach out to, similar to what she was talking about earlier. How do I achieve the same things or resolve this issue independent of the system? What's available to me? What other parent may have gone through this that I could reach out to? Making those resources and how you get to that's not necessarily a system answer, but more of a community answer to resolve that, is how we ended up having a very positive impact. So if you look at the latest data report, those numbers are way down as it relates to arrest, as it relates to detention care. And you look at who was funneled into those channels. And even when you disaggregate the data by race and ethnicity, the impact was greatest for the minority youth. Now we have a little bit of an issue with Hispanic youth that has occurred, and we're trying to figure out why that is. But it was one of those things where we talked to the families to see what was going on. We understood the data, we understood the policy and the practices that was feeding the disparate outcomes, and then our responses got to the root of the issue. So it's now more of a preventative effort. It's not a system response, it's a preventative effort that is making those families whole and allowing them to operate to resolve those issues independent of the system itself.
Okay. At this time, we would like to invite our panelists to give any closing remarks that you have. And also, if you would like to speak to any advice you have for students and community members who are here, who are wondering how they can galvanize their communities around this issue of equity, also feel free to speak to that. But we'll give you all a chance to make closing remarks. Whoever wants to start.
I just want to say thank you for listening. Hopefully we'll be hanging out a little bit after this to have more, one-on-one conversations with anyone who doesn't love speaking out in a group, which I totally get. I guess I would just say that we have to keep calling it out. We have to talk about what's really happening. I mean, the people who are in this room are some of the few people who know about the child protection system. I mean, I think while the criminal legal system has been sort of more openly and criticized, and they're talking about really interesting theories of change, from transformative justice to abolition, you don't hear those conversations about child protection. Even my own colleagues in my own office, which is a public defender of all people who are concerned with racial equity, sort of look askance at the foster system and say, well, I mean, I don't know what's going on there. I mean, that seems like families might really need that. Or think it's like criminal light, like it doesn't do as much harm, and I say, oh my gosh, you know what? Ask people, what do they care more about, their liberty or their children? It's their children. This is the system that matters almost the most. And so we got to keep calling it out. And I will say that, as a white person, I especially have to keep calling it out. And I have to name my privilege, even when it's uncomfortable to do so. And I need to acknowledge my role, not just my biases every day, but my role, how I benefit from structural racism, which I do every day. And I need to call it out. When my clients say to me, oh, you're just like one of them. I mean, you're just there. You probably get paid, more if you make me submit to the charges. I don't argue with them about that. I say, I hope with time, I can hold that truth, and I don't doubt that feeling is rational. I understand why you believe it. I've never felt it, but I understand enough to know that you're believing it and you're feeling it is rational. And we're going to have this journey together, and I'm going to do a lot more listening than I am talking when we're talking about your case and your family. And sometimes we end up having a really good, honest relationship, and sometimes we don't, because that's not owed to me as a white woman in this society. And so I feel that very strongly. It makes the work hard, but it's an important thing to hold as we do that work.
I've worked in child welfare for well over 20 years, and I think that the best thing that I have seen, and particularly over the past several years, is community partnerships, which was a term that I did not hear 20 years ago. And it's actually part of our culture now to hear that term. We have to engage our community partners. So because as a child welfare system, no group, DCF cannot do it on their own. The CBCs cannot do it on their own. They need all of us to stand with them in order to ensure that Florida's child welfare system becomes really one of the best in the nation. And so with that said, it's going to take strength. It's going to take guts for all community partners to get to the point. I love the word that Corey said, to become, get away from being risk averse, to truly have the real conversations it's going to take in order to truly make an impact on issues of bias, on issues of racism within the system, to ensure that all families receive the appropriate services, no matter the level of poverty or the level of wealth within that given community. So I do appreciate and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to just speak a little bit of my truth to you all and talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we're doing within this system.
One of the consequences of functioning in a world who built its identity off of dismantling Black and brown families and communities is that we sit here this many generations later having the same conversation, asking the same questions about how do we move forward, how do we gain the attention of the people in positions of power and decision making to be willing to relinquish strongholds to privilege and systems that reinforce their status and their ability to live freely in a way that is not equally offered to people of color. One of the consequences of living in a world that built its identity off of dismantling Black and brown families is that we exist here having this very conversation. And so I think that some of the work requires us to be aware of that, to hold that truth, and to remind ourselves that we can create anew the brilliance of those same Black and brown families and individuals and communities that were where the effort was to dismantle and destroy not only their families and their communities, but their spirit, their sense of self, their belief in the hope and respect of their own, of our own right to be, right? The idea that we exist in this world means that there are so many layers of this that we are fighting. One thing that I would encourage is to ask us to look at ourselves. Every day we have a chance to show up in the world as the ideal that we are trying to work towards and to create. So who am I being today? How am I having a conversation with the person walking down the street whose life and whose story and whose experience I may not know? And for those of us who have the privilege of sitting in spaces that are related to child welfare, how am I showing up there? And I think that often in this work, we try to figure out, well, what's the formula to fix it? Again, the brilliance of Blackness is that we are not monolithic. So what's going to work for one family's experience is not going to be the recipe for every family. So is the work that we're doing leaving enough breathing room so that a family who has a different story than the one that I just saw yesterday, that their story has an opportunity to live, that the narrative that we leave this exchange with is really built on their own terms. So how am I making space? How are we making space for people to really show up as who they are? How are we making space to not just look at what we have identified as risks or neglect, but to look at and make space for the family to tell the story of how they arrived at where they are? And then how can we align and collaborate with them to define what healing looks like moving forward? Are we, in all of our white coats and professional licenses and whatever administrative positions that we're holding, do we have enough dignity and connection to our own humanity to be able to hold space in that way so that we can really create transformation?
I don't know how to come behind that. I think that the question you asked was, what advice would we give to someone that wants to engage in this work? I think I would say that you need to know yourself for sure. What are your biases? Like you said, how do you show up? Because you can't show up exhibiting the behavior that you want to change. That's a problem. You need to have a tough skin because it's not easy work. You need to set goals. That's really important. Understand what those goals are, be able to articulate them to others, understand the system that you're trying to change. And I think that you need to be willing to move forward in this work, no matter who chooses to go with you or who chooses to not go with you. Because if you are doing it for some sort of glory, or if you're doing it because you think you're going to have a cheer team behind you all the time, this is not the work for you. I think that you need to be really aware of definitions, how you define, how to articulate it. And I think you just have to have a sense of resilience. My team doesn't like when I say this, but I say we're bubble dolls. We get knocked down 50 times a day, but we got to get back up and keep going because the goal is worth it.
Well, the mic has been dropped. I just want to thank our distinguished panel and thank you all. This has been such a rich dialogue. It's a conversation that we have been having that we need to continue. And I just, my last closing thought is, I'm sitting here doing a lot of self-examination. We know what we're up against, but I'm feeling motivated, hopeful, encouraged, on fire to and reignited to examine my space of action. And I know a lot of others are doing the same. So I want to encourage us, think about the power we have in this room. Let's keep the conversations while we're going here and fuel ourselves to go out and continue to do the work to make a difference. So can we give another round of applause for our panel? Thank you.
Great job. This was amazing. On behalf of the Florida Institute for Child Welfare, I want to say thank you for being uncomfortable for the welfare of our children. I know today could be difficult for us all. It was difficult. We were faced with some real truths in which we have to stand, and we have to stand in that moment and really deal with the conversation. So the call to action that I want to challenge us all with today, of course, we live in a social media generation. We all have followers. You all have influence of someone, someplace. I would ask that you use our hashtags and use something for "you will show up for race equity," right? Hashtag "I will show up for race equity." I think if we can do that, we may be able to start trending. We may be able to continue this conversation, not just within this room, but where it really matters in the community, with those who you feel comfortable being implicitly biased with. So again, thank you all. Thank our panelists. And before I bring up Dr. Price again to officially close us out, I do want to quickly let us know tomorrow, we took notes today. We do work tomorrow. We have Dr. Khatib Waheed here tomorrow. He'll amazing keynote and a workshop, right? We're going to get even more uncomfortable. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, so we make sure everybody gets back here, right? But I do want to let you know, we do have a reception immediately following this. Please stay and hang around and continue this dialogue. So again, without ado, Dr. Price, go ahead and close us out.
Yes, you all can stay up here with me. Yeah. Wow. So I'm going to be brief. I generally am. I don't know if my team will agree with that, but I try to be brief. But that was amazing. I'm still kind of soaking it all in. Thank you all for hanging in there with us. Like Kevin said, these things aren't always easy to do, but I think everyone in this room is brave. I like what Corey said earlier. You don't have to do this, but you're here. And I certainly appreciate your presence. And when I see you in this room, I feel that you are going to permeate the agencies where you work. I just feel that for some reason right now, and I appreciate it. Again, please stick around for our reception. We want to continue the conversations, not to put too much pressure on Khatib, but I do want to acknowledge that he's over here. He's going to be our leader tomorrow. Khatib Waheed is somebody I very much admire, so I am just tickled pink that he's with us. So he is going to be leading us tomorrow. Come back. Like Kevin said, I hope he didn't scare you away. We're not going to make it too painful, but I think it'll be an amazing experience. So I'll see you at the reception. Am I forgetting anything, Mariana? She's the other side of my brain for this event. But thank you all for being here. The reception starts in maybe 15, 20 minutes. So thank you. You are so amazing. Oh my gosh.
You will be able to put your evaluations right at the front desk, please.